The Norman and Florence Brody Family Foundation is dedicated to exploring topics of national and international importance and is proud to support Policy Watch with Doug Besheroff at the University of Maryland. From the University of Maryland, this is Policy Watch with Doug Besheroff.
The financial crisis that began in 2007 brought large parts of the U.S. economy to the brink of collapse. In response, the U.S. Congress approved the Troubled Asset Relief Program, or TARP, a $700 billion bailout of several key financial and industrial firms. But when many of these firms continued to pay exorbitant amounts to their top executives, taxpayer outrage reached fever pitch. The government responded in June 2009 by appointing Kenneth R. Feinberg, one of America's most prominent lawyers, to regulate and oversee the compensation of top executives at firms that received bailout funds from the U.S. taxpayer. He joins us now to discuss his role as Special Master for TARP executive compensation, as well as to discuss the broader issues of executive risk-taking and compensation in the U.S. financial sector. And now the host of Policy Watch, Doug Besheroff.
Kenneth Feinberg, welcome back to Policy Watch and the University of Maryland.
Thank you.
So you're best known as the person who successfully dispersed $7 billion for the September 11th Victims Fund. But now you're doing something that's probably even less thankful, at least to the people you're trying to help. You are, I'm going to read the official title, Special Master for TARP Executive Compensation. TARP, of course, is the Troubled Asset Relief Program. This is the federal government's response to the financial meltdown in 2008 and 2009. Well, the economy is still suffering from that, and I suppose the first question I should ask you is, what's the role of the Special Master in relation to TARP and the financial problems we face?
Congress passed a law. The law says that if you work at one of just 7 companies, Bank of America, Citigroup, AIG, GM, GMAC, Chrysler, Chrysler Financial, those 7 companies only, a person will be appointed by the Secretary of the Treasury to determine compensation for the top 25 people, officials, in each of those companies, and will also determine compensation structures for officials 26 to 100 in those 7 companies only. That is the mandatory jurisdiction of the Special Master.
And what guides you in that process? How do you view your mission, your purpose?
The statute speaks to that. The statute says that the Special Master shall, in determining compensation, take into account certain variables, such as make sure that your compensation decisions keep these companies in business so they can repay the taxpayer.
Can you assess this for us, this argument that these men and women have to be paid these really princely sums?
As important as the dollars, my task also includes deciding the structure of that compensation. Is it all cash? Should much of that compensation be paid in stock, tying the officials' compensation to the future well-being of the company and the shareholders? How long should that stock be held before it's redeemable by the official? There are a lot of variations here that are mandated by the statute that entered into my decision process.
Sure, and that business about whether they should be paid in cash or stock and when the stock should become available for them to sell, this connects to the question of whether they have a long-term view, a short-term view of the risks they're taking, and so that they don't take advantage and make a ton of money one year and then the company either loses money or goes bankrupt.
That's right. I made it very clear in my 2009 compensation decisions. Very low base cash salaries, I mean, relatively speaking, under $500,000. The rest of your compensation, and nobody's getting $38 million, I assure you. The highest was $10.5 million, I believe. A lot of money. But the bulk of that is in long-term stock that cannot be sold for 5 years, so that your value, your total compensation, is really tied to the 5-year growth of the company that you work for. And my goal was to try and minimize risk-taking, or, as you point out, Doug, quick flips of stock, by requiring these officials to hold on to that stock and grow with the company or be at risk.
So when you propose these rules, which are quite different from the rules in the past, and I take it the Wall Street executives were delighted to hear this suggestion.
Well, publicly, the Wall Street executives have acquiesced. They have no choice under the statute. I think that privately, they understood, I hope they understood, why I must be influenced by the statute, by Main Street populist outrage at the size of these previous compensation packages, and I think they came to rest with it.
I couldn't find too much detail about the perks that you disallowed. But I remember when, I can't remember his name now, the former head of GE, got into a somewhat ugly divorce case. It turned out that GE had promised, even after he was no longer CEO, a certain number of theater tickets, a certain number of flights on their private plane. The perks seem pretty large and again, extreme for the current situation.
I issued rulings that no individual at any of these 7 companies, GE is not involved, could receive more than $25,000 in total perk. Golf club dues, country club dues, private use of the jet. $25,000 maximum. Anything beyond that, I have to approve individually. And we felt that the American people were outraged by some of these perks.
So let's go into politics of this in the Congress a little bit. It seems to me it's just what you said, which is as public anger subsides, it will become progressively more difficult to pass these kinds of reforms. And yet it feels as if we're still quite far away from enacting any legislation to fix these past, let's just call them mistakes.
I can't speak to the politics of whether Congress will pass a regulatory reform or corporate governance reform. Congressman Barney Frank, has been a leader here, working very hard to try and get bipartisan legislation. We'll have to see. But the politics of this can't be ignored in terms of angry public sentiment about executive compensation at a time when you have unemployment at 10% and a great deal of uncertainty about the future of the American economy. It's understandable.
And at a time when some of the profitability of these firms is just a function of borrowing money from the federal government at almost 0 interest and lending it back to the federal government at 3 or 4% interest, it's a little difficult to lose money when you do that.
Well, that's your editorial comment, not mine.
I know that, yeah, for sure, but it does seem that way. You've had a chance to explore the workings of Wall Street, not just in this situation, but others. And I know many people think that reforms have to be more widespread than just executive compensation. And you and I have talked about some of the proposals that Volcker has made and that the president seems to have adopted. Can you talk a little bit about that from the point of view of your experience?
Yes. My experience, you see, is limited to these 7 companies. Now 5, you're right. Citibank and Bank of America have repaid the taxpayer. They're no longer subject to my jurisdiction. So I have a very limited role. Also, my role deals with the structure of compensation more than the total amount. What the administration's focused on with its bank fee approach and the Volcker approach is to try and get at a much more pervasive problem than just 5 companies, and to deal across the board with the size of this excessive compensation through some legislation that will rein in the dollars, the value, the size of these compensation packages. I can't really deal with that as much. I have a much more limited role.
How difficult will it be to create legislation that limits these packages, given that it seems there's no limit to the imagination of corporate and legal America?
Well, that's an interesting question. I must say, if you're looking for one area of domestic policy where there's likely to be bipartisanship, it's reining in corporate pay. I don't think that's a red state, blue state, Democrat, Republican, liberal, conservative issue.
We'll see.
We'll see. We'll see. But I can see in an election year some effort by Congress to adopt some of the administration's most creative and priority proposals.
Now, there are a few ways that your actions don't have quite the bite that they might otherwise seem to have. I read how many of these executives have these very generous pension plans which have already vested. You can't get to those, is that right?
I can't get to any contractual, legally binding plan that was agreed to before the TARP statute was even enacted. What I can do in setting prospective compensation is to take into account the value of those grandfathered agreements, and I've been doing that.
What's your sense of, if this passes, and the approach that you've taken becomes the general rule, how will that change Wall Street?
Well, hopefully it will diminish the likelihood of excessive risk-taking. If corporate officials don't have a guaranteed compensation package, their compensation will depend in large part on the long-term success of the company they work for. Hopefully they won't be willing to take excessive risks because their own compensation will be tied to that of the company they work for. That's the goal, hopefully.
You know, people talk about, quote, excessive risk. Can you give us some examples?
Yes, an example of excessive risk. I'm asked all the time under the statute, what constitutes excessive risk? I go, I know it when I see it. One individual at Citigroup was being paid $100 million a year.
Is this the fellow who has the castle somewhere?
Yes, as an energy trader. I concluded that that constituted excessive risk for the company, and that nobody should be making that type of money in a risky trading venture. And as a result, that person left the company with his business and moved elsewhere in order to avoid my prescriptions.
And I'm curious, is he still able to command that kind of...
I have no idea. He's no longer subject to my jurisdiction, so I don't know what's happened. But I must tell you that the American people, when you talk about numbers like this, they are outraged. And no matter how you try and explain comparative data and worth, the importance of an individual to a company, the uncertainty of the economy that we live in today, and the fact that unemployment is where it is at the current time, just fuels an anger among the American people that cannot be assuaged by simply saying, well, we'll tie compensation to long-term stock, and we will try and limit, guaranteed income. I think what the administration and the president are wisely trying to do is rein in the size of some of these compensation packages among financial institutions.
Now, the Brits have done this a little differently with a 50% tax on bonuses.
That's right.
Do you have a sense of how that's worked out?
No, I think it's premature. I don't know how it's working. It's just been enacted, and everybody, I think, in government is watching to see exactly what the impact is of that tax.
I guess the temptation would be to just double the size of the bonuses.
That's one. Another is to leave London and move your office abroad. Another is to defer compensation so that the tax, I believe in London, in England, is just a one-year tax. Defer excess compensation until the subsequent year in the hopes that the tax won't be reenacted. I mean, there are a lot of creative ways that corporate officials might try and avoid the harshness of the tax.
And I was so glad to learn that you had addressed the perks problem, because the British, as you may remember, in the 50s and 60s, when they had very high tax rates, the answer was tremendous perks. Everything from suits to cars to apartments.
Never underestimate the creativity of corporate America.
Yeah. If only that had something to do with the products that they produce. But that's my editorial comment.
That's your comment.
I was struck by your response about the September 11th fund that you administered. So my last question to you now is, what have you learned? What opinions have changed in your own mind after this experience on Wall Street pay?
Two things I've learned. One is I've learned firsthand, as you have pointed out, this tremendous gap between the perception of worth on Wall Street versus the rest of America. Mr. Feinberg, you're only paying me $4 million. Why don't you like me? I mean, you hear that quite a bit. The second thing I've learned is a humbling experience. I've learned that in our society, compensation is not simply about what do I need to live a certain lifestyle. In our society, compensation is a surrogate for worth, for individual integrity, value in society. And it is very emotional when executive officials ask me about compensation. It's not just about greed or in this job I should make X dollars. It's more a validation of that person's whole integrity, his or her own lifestyle, own moral view of themselves. It strikes at the core of what an individual believes he or she is worth in our society. So it can be very emotional. It's not just dollars and cents. There's a lot at stake. And I've learned that it is a very sore point among people who believe they're entitled to this compensation as a measure of their entire existence. And that makes the job tough, I must say. There's a lot at stake.
Yes, I've heard so many people say, what you're paid is how we keep score in this country.
That's I think that's absolutely right, how we keep score.
But speaking as someone who gets a university salary, but also sees how little we pay our scientists and so forth, and people in the helping professions, it's a worrisome thing for the future of America if we're going to be only measuring people by how much they earn.
I think that's right, but I must say that's a historical reality back to the very founding of our republic. Compensation as a measure of value among individuals, I don't think this is a recent phenomenon. I think it goes all the way back to the very beginnings of America, and I think right now it's very pronounced because of the economic climate. But it's not new, and there's a reoccurring need to address it, as I'm trying to do now.
Well, that seems like a good point to turn to our audience for questions. And if you wish, identify yourself as you ask your question. Jim.
Sure. My name is Jeff Krasny. I'm a CEO for IV Capital here in Bethesda, Maryland. Mr. Feinberg, regarding the salaries and bonuses, why should these individuals receive any bonuses?
Well, I'm not sure that bonus compensation is warranted in every case. I'm rather sympathetic to your question and to the point in your question. I must say, when Congress passed this law, it made it very clear in the statute that punishing these officials would not be sanctioned if, as a result, the company would be threatened with extinction. Now, the real question and the challenge for me, you pose a very good question. The challenge is reading the statute, how can I limit compensation while at the same time not appearing vindictive and at the same time making sure that the congressional directive is followed, keep the companies in business. Now, two of the companies, Bank of America, Citigroup, they repaid the taxpayer. That's my primary objective. The taxpayer was repaid about $85 billion. They are gone. They are no longer subject to my jurisdiction. The other 5 companies still are, and I'm trying to balance the point you make about rewarding individuals who contributed to the crisis and at the same time keeping the companies in business. Most of the arguments I hear today are that the individuals who helped cause the problem are long gone from the company, and we're now dealing with new employees. We shall see.
Thank you. Good evening. I'm Mac Dessler, member of the faculty at the School of Public Policy. I wonder if you thought at all about whether in legislation or in company governance, individuals could, either nationwide or company specific, be somehow empowered to make the sort of prudential judgments that you are making in a way that they would be enforced, or at least they would be, say, strong recommendations to the board of directors of a particular company or something like that.
That question could be the subject of a very effective seminar at the University of Maryland School of Public Policy. I'm very dubious myself about whether the government should be as involved as I am by statute in actually calculating what an individual makes. I'm not sure that's a good thing for government to do. Now, whether or not there ought to be some sort of government monitor to watch these companies in terms of corporate governance and how decisions are made, there's something there, I think. But I don't think it's at all likely that Congress will expand my authority, and I don't think Congress should, frankly, even if I'm that person.
Good afternoon. I'm Bob Schwartzbart. Government spending is so often equated with money spent over the counter by the government. But is it not really anything that's a drain on the Treasury? And my question is, how much of these multi-million-dollar pay packages are deductible, actually paid by the taxpayer? And what, if anything, could be done to exercise greater control at that level?
Another seminar question. I mean, I can only answer your very good question by saying, and this is not a satisfactory answer for your question, my role here is very, very limited. I have no authority to delve into the deductibility or the subsidization of executive pay by the United States tax system and the system invoked by TARP and the Office of Financial Stability in allowing these companies to stay in business. If I got into that, I would need a staff of hundreds of people, and my jurisdiction would go way beyond the statute. My role is much more limited, and I think your question, wise as it is probably directed to others at Treasury rather than to the special master who's just trying to use his calculations in setting compensation. But it certainly is a good question.
Thank you, sir.
Well, let me again thank Ken Feinberg for being with us. And let me say to those of you in our viewing audience that thank you for tuning in. And if you want to write to us, you can email us at policywatch@UMD, that's UMD for University of Maryland, .edu. And again, Ken Feinberg, thank you so much for being with us.
This program was produced by the University of Maryland, which is solely responsible for its content. The Norman and Florence Brody Family Foundation is dedicated to exploring topics of national and international importance and is proud to support Policy Watch with Doug Besheroff at the University of Maryland.
We are PBS.